Hello, welcome to Go Library. This is Dr. Ming. From today, the 29th April 2020, we are going to broadcast in English a series of interviews to expose and end the CCP. There can't be a better way to begin than by interviewing a person who has dedicated all her lifetime to the Free Tibet, Free China, anti-CCP movement. Maura Moynihan is an American journalist, film producer, and artist. She comes from a prestigious background, graduating from Harvard University. Her father, Dr. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, was the former ambassador to India and the United Nations. He had served as the senator of New York State for 24 years till he passed away in 2001. Maura could have lived a comfortable upper-class life, but has chosen to walk a very difficult path for the well-being of the peoples who live on the other side of the world and do not even have kinship with her. Maura Moynihan, her life, her work, all inspiring. So, hello, Maura. It is a pleasure and a privilege to meet you.
Oh, thank you so much, Ming. It's an honor to be on Voice of Go Library with you.
Oh, thank you so much. So how are you?
Well, it's I'm in New York.
Yes.
And as we know, New York has become the epicenter for the CCP virus.
Yeah.
And it is nothing short of catastrophic.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And you are a New Yorker. That's your home city.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, I am.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you went to the city last week. Mm-hmm. What struck you the most?
Well, you know, New York is always been the center of America in so many ways.
Yeah.
Broadway is there. The stock market is there. It's the head of publishing, fashion, art, so many important industries. It's also a world capital.
Yes.
And what makes New York a special place is its extraordinary diversity.
Yes.
And it's that there are so many people in New York from all over the world who come and share their stories, their languages, their cultures, and their arts. And to see the streets of New York shuttered and empty.
Oh,
and to
yeah.
See frightened, and to see people have to go around in masks. All the restaurants closed, all of Broadway closed, the Metropolitan Museum is closed, Columbia University is closed. The only thing that's open are a few grocery stores, and of course the hospitals. And the deaths are now coming, 3 deaths per minute.
Oh, yeah. It's sad, isn't it?
It's a tragedy. It's a catastrophe.
It is a catastrophe, yeah. So, yeah, okay. So, during this lockdown, what are you missing the most?
Oh, absolutely. I'm missing my friends, my fellow New Yorkers who are creative, wonderful, and generous and sophisticated, wonderful people. I'm missing that sense of community that we always shared.
Yeah.
I miss being able to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
Yeah, yeah, all right. So after the lockdown, what are you most looking forward to?
I'm really looking forward to seeing people finally waking up to the truth about the Chinese Communist Party.
Oh, wow.
And I'm looking forward to people coming together, Republicans and Democrats. No more partisanship on this. We all have to come together, and we've got to stand with the people of Tibet, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and China and overthrow this evil totalitarian dictatorship that has brought the world to its knees. And as we know full well, the first and foremost, the victims are the Chinese people.
Yeah.
And so I would like to stand on the side. I would like to see more of my fellow Americans stand with the Chinese people and not stand with their overseers in the Chinese Communist Party, which is the story we've been told by the elites for so long. Is that we ought to work with China. We've got to help China be a strong country. I say, which China? The China of Hong Kong, the China of Taiwan, the vision of the Dalai Lama, my hero and my friend who's pictured here, or Jiang Zemin, Li Peng, Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping, and Chairman Mao. Their China is a very different China. Their China is a China of control of the world's largest country by a group of old men in the Politburo who rule 1.4 billion people, 1.4 billion people with no free press and no elections. And this is the China that has been promoted and financed and supported and embraced by the elites, many of whom live in New York. And I have a lot of very wealthy friends whom I've argued with for years, who have money in New York, and I've said, why do you have money in China? I go, why do you have your money in communist China? Do you support having children tortured in concentration camps? Do you support a $1 billion forced organ harvesting industry? Do you remember what happened in Tiananmen Square? You must have seen the footage. And for even just 2 months ago before the lockdown, a very wealthy woman I know said, oh, Maura, everybody has money in China. What's the problem? I said, well, then you're funding all of these crimes against humanity. She looked at me like she wanted to cut my head off. Oh. This is an American billionaire who considers herself a liberal Democrat. And she's I'm so woke. And the politics, oh my God, if it's a small African country where has political prisoners, or if India has a political prisoner, it's a catastrophe. But China can't say anything. It's terrible hypocrisy. Terrible hypocrisy.
Yeah. So I can understand, in your view, this pandemic is not merely a SARS-like flu, right? So what is it then? Yeah. So,
well, I think the experts are telling us that we'll know in time. And my contacts in the military, in military intelligence, are telling me that, of course, the Chinese covered it up. We all know that the virus first appeared last fall. And the whistleblower, Dr. Li of Wuhan, alerted Beijing to the existence of this very, very deadly violence. In December, he was tortured. He was forced to write a self-confession, and he died from the CCP virus. And of course, they covered that up, and we found out about it later when it was too late. And we're also not able to get the sequencing genome pattern from the Wuhan scientists, further evidence of a cover-up. We'll know in time, but it certainly looks like it was a bioweapon that escaped from the laboratory in Wuhan, the Institute of Virology. But of course, since China is typically not sharing any information with us and covering up, because they're more concerned about protecting the power and the control of the Chinese Communist Party than about the Chinese people or the people of the world. They've made their priorities clear.
Yeah. So you mentioned that in February, you bought tons of personal protection equipment. As you know, this coronavirus was coming to New York. So how did you know that?
Because I'm a China watcher. Because I don't have any faith in mainstream media in America. Because the New York Times, which calls itself the paper of record, takes 2-page color ads from China Daily every week, and they've been doing it for almost 20 years now. And they push this narrative of Russia is responsible for everything in our society that is wrong, when anyone who knows anything about the world will tell you that it's not Russia, it's China that is driving the authoritarianism, that is driving global warming, that is the source of this pandemic. And I worked for many years at Radio Free Asia, at the Tibet service of Radio Free Asia. And so I also, I speak Hindi and Tibetan and Nepali. I studied some Thai. I studied a little Mandarin, a little Cantonese. I never got very good at it. But so I get my news from Asian news sources.
All right.
I don't rely on Western mainstream media because they are propagandists for the Chinese Communist Party. They are.
So, yeah.
Yes,
okay. Is. Yeah. So, what are the crucial measures to deal with and end this pandemic, in your view?
It's going to be difficult as long as the Chinese Communist Party is in power.
All right. So it's all about.
The library knows that, right?
Yes.
But I think one thing we could absolutely do right now in the United States, and we don't need to ask the permission of the EU or get any kind of alliance with the EU, because Europe is also overwhelmed with the virus.
Yeah.
Look what's happening. Look at the death toll. I have friends in London on respirators. I have friends in Italy who've died. I have friends in New York who've died. We've got 3 deaths per minute in New York right now. I don't know the figures for Europe, but one thing we can do absolutely right now, which we in the Tibet movement have been recommending for a very long time, is to seize the assets of the CCP that are in the United States.
Great.
Why don't we start with the Xinhua Tower in Times Square, New York City?
Wow.
It's worth $5 billion, at least, maybe more. I remember when that tower came up. I went to Times Square. It was a cold, rainy night. I had my umbrella. I stood there in the rain and I watched. The tallest tower coming up had Xinhua, the propaganda wing of the evil Chinese Communist Party, which killed 80 million Chinese, Tibetan, and Uyghur people. How is it possible? How is it possible, I thought, that the United States has welcomed them right in the beating heart of America? And I watched that and I felt disgust. I felt anger and I felt fear. Well, why don't we seize that building for damages? Because another thing that's happening in New York and is happening all over the country is economic carnage because of the pandemic. People are getting desperate. There's a budget shortfall in every state. People can't go back to work. People are frightened. And in 1 month, the Chinese Communist Party has killed more people and has caused more economic damage than the Vietnam War.
Yeah, much more.
Yeah, much more. Probably, I don't want to compare the figures of World War I and World War II yet, but let's see. That certainly it's on track, and it's very, very scary. So also, I remember Xinhua built a $50 million headquarters in Washington, D.C. It was about 13 years ago. I wrote about it. I wrote to senators. I tried to get people to care. My father was already dead, so I didn't have a senator's office that I could use, which I did before. Yeah. And everybody told me, oh, come on, what's the big deal? Come on, Maura. This goes back to a very, very important feature of how we got here, how this happened, how this was allowed to happen. I recommend all your viewers read this extraordinary book by my friend James Mann, called The China Fantasy. Yeah. Where capitalism will not bring democracy to China, and how Western elites explain away the human rights atrocities of the CCP with this fantasy that Coca-Cola is going to bring democracy. Well, that hasn't happened, has it?
No.
Plenty of Coca-Cola, there's Burger King, there's Nike, there's the NBA, all of these franchises, American franchises, you see them all, I'm sorry, Nike's Japanese, but you see them all over China, but you don't see democracy, do you? In fact, under Xi Jinping, there's been a hardening of the communist system, which is making it more and more difficult to get real information out of China and to cooperate, some of the elitists to explain away China's crimes, like the Asian Society of New York. Just 2 weeks ago, published a letter, 2 weeks ago today, it was on a Wednesday, that I found morally repugnant. It said, this is no time to be tough on China. They control our medical supply. We're going to need them, and America has to come to terms with its shortcomings. And China's doing a good job. And it was signed by a great many dignitaries. You can easily find it. Why don't we post it up on Guo Library? I posted it all over Twitter and all over my Facebook accounts and so forth. Yeah. And it was signed by a great many American dignitaries. The first on the list was Madeleine Albright, who was Secretary of State for Bill Clinton when he was president in the 90s. He's one of China's good little boys. He's the one who gave them most favored nation trading status, permanent normal trading relations. And I got arrested in front of the PRC embassy in Washington, D.C. in 1994 to protest that. I went to jail to protest that. And as he was leaving in 2000, he got China into the World Trade Organization. Yes. And this is one thing that Jim goes into in this book, how the gamble of bringing China into the WTO and removing the annual review of the PRC's human rights record would magically make them change and make them democratic, but it actually made things worse because they realized they weren't going to have that annual human rights review, so they could go ahead and torture children. They could cut the hands off of poets. They could lock Liu Xiaobo, the great Chinese poet and author who helped create Charter 08 and received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010 and died in a Chinese prison in 2017 under orders from Xi Jinping for the same crime as Dr. Li, the crime of counter-revolutionary thought. Well, all the Coca-Cola in the world hasn't changed that, has it?
So based on what you said, it's that the CCP is totally responsible for this pandemic. So to end this pandemic, we must sort out the CCP. That's what you said. And also a very practical way to do that is to seize and freeze and the Chinese, say, propagandists or say like state companies assets in the US, right? Yeah, it's great. So, and how do you compare this difficult moment with others in your life? So, in terms of the New York lockdown, so it's
that's a very, very, very good question. And I have to say, this is absolutely the most catastrophic event as a New Yorker I have ever lived through. I have never seen my fair city in such trauma. We're all suffering collective trauma. We're worried about our friends and neighbors. We're worried about our doctors. We're worried about the police force. I mean, yesterday, a doctor committed suicide in New York because emergency couldn't take it anymore. There have been massive cuts in education. Remote learning isn't working. It is stressing parents out. And New York is also a great center of education. Some of the top universities in the world are located in the New York area. And my father was very close to Columbia University, which is also shut. New York University also shut. Another thing we have to address as we try to climb out of this pandemic is the mental health crisis that it has created. So if Xi Jinping wanted to bring America to his knees, to traumatize and destroy the hopes of young Americans in particular, he's done a good job. Good for you, Papa Xi.
Yeah, that's why Steve Bannon called this, the pandemic in New York and the lockdown of New York as the Pearl Harbor moment.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. No, I agree. Because one thing we're also seeing, and again, New York is an important test case because there's not a single elite in this world, and that includes Chinese Communist Party elites, that doesn't have a foothold in New York City. Wall Street is there, and the big banks are all headquartered there. And a new poll just came out on Monday, and it's an election year. We're in the middle of an election cycle, and the New York primary was supposed to be last week, and it's been postponed till June. The new poll showed 9 out of 10 Americans have an unfavorable view of the Chinese government, which means the CCP.
Yes.
But the elites are still apologizing for them. That letter from the Ancient Society has their names right there. And of course, I think many Americans know by now, one of the most famous men in America is Bill Gates. Bill Gates, who went to Harvard with me. Actually, he is a Harvard dropout. He never finished. People say he stole all of the Microsoft technology, and he was ruthless and he went in the setup of Microsoft. There have been several biographies about him that are extremely flattering, but there are also some that tell the true story of Mr. Bill Gates. Well, Mr. Bill Gates went on CNN, which has also been appalling in its coverage of the CCP virus, because it seems to be taking the CCP propaganda points and repeating them. Just when the lockdown started, CNN had a report that President Trump seems to be blaming China for the virus. Well, Secretary of State Pompeo had to clarify this to CNN by saying no source less than the Chinese Communist Party said the virus came from Wuhan, China. So yes, It did. But I mean, and the CNN reporters are extraordinarily disrespectful to the president every day in the press conferences in Washington. And on Sunday, Bill Gates gave an interview where he said, America handled the outbreak very poorly and China's done everything right.
Yeah.
And it's gone viral. And so all you have to do is a little bit of research on Mr. Gates, which I've done for years. And you'll see pictures of him loving it up with Xi Jinping and Hu Jintao and Johnson, who's still alive. And he, 3 years ago in 2017, he was inducted into the Chinese Institute of Engineering to help China develop their nuclear capacity.
Well,
and this flies under the radar here because mainstream media won't report about it.
Yeah.
Our mainstream media thinks there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah. This is why it's so difficult. You know, not only the CCP has they inflicted such a tragedy to the New York City to cause it totally locked down, and also it makes things so difficult. You know, not well people have this mental depression, and these people, just within New York, Americans, they take the side of the CCP, which make the moment even more difficult to bear. Yeah, this is ridiculous.
To clarify that it's not the American people, the regular working stiffs who pay taxes.
Yeah,
it's billionaire elites. Take the side of the CCP and many, many, many of our politicians who've been bought by the CCP and take CCP money happily with no shame at all.
Hello, welcome to Go Library. This is Dr. Ming. We continue our program Maura Moynihan, talking about the CCP's accomplices in the US. The questions are, how have the American elites in Washington, Silicon Valley, and Wall Street, as well as business associations, human rights organizations, and world-class universities, sold out America to the CCP? What made Maura write about Google kowtowing to the CCP in 2008? How has the Americans' political sentiment towards the CCP changed? Over to Maura.
Billionaire elites take the side of the CCP and many, many, many of our politicians who've been bought by the CCP and take CCP money happily with no shame at all.
No.
And those same elites, those American elites, sold out the American people when they shipped all their jobs to communist China.
Yeah, we will talk about, we talk about
the headquarters of IBM, International Business Machines. It started the first generation of personal computers. And it had Corning, and it had Kodak and Polaroid and all of these tech companies. They're all gone. And what do we have instead in upstate New York instead of research laboratories and thriving communities? We have fentanyl. We have broken communities. We have broken lives. I was shocked when I went to Poughkeepsie a couple of years ago, where Vassar College is. Again, IBM used to be a big employer there. In the middle of the day, I saw so many grown men passed out on the main street with needles in their arms from the opioid crisis. And I saw all of the main streets for sale, for rent, or broken down, and people doing crack cocaine in what 20, 30 years ago was a thriving community is now a broken shell. And we also know that fentanyl is coming from communist China through cartels in Mexico. But we also don't see the elites coming to the defense of the American people. They're coming to the defense of the CCP as their fellow countrymen die 3 a minute in New York. Probably more. It's going to be 100,000 deaths by the weekend, according to projections by doctors. So I had an idea that I wanted to share with you and your listeners.
Yeah, this is basically we now move to the topic of the CCP's accomplices in the US. So we must there's lots of things to explore. So my question, what is the view about this? So you talk about this CCP's accomplices. So how they affect your community. So what is the book you are going to share with us, which is a good one?
Oh yes, it's now sold out. My
Oh,
friend
right.
Rosemary Gibson wrote this wonderful book called China RX.
What does that mean?
The risks
RX.
of America's dependence on China for medicine.
All right.
And this book came out in 2018.
Mm.
And typically, no one would put Rosemary on their talk shows. Nobody would interview her. Steve Bannon put her up on War Room Pandemic. And now that the lockdown has come, now that people are traumatized, that now that people are dying and people have lost their jobs and they've lost their security and their pensions, the book sold out.
Mm.
And the book tells the story of how it started with Bill Clinton in 1994, when he gave Communist China permanent normal trading relations, and then got them into the WTO.
Yeah.
All of our medical supplies got outsourced mostly to China. The last penicillin factory in the United States was in Syracuse, New York, in upstate New York, and it closed in 2004. So very soon we're going to see shortages of urgently needed medical supplies, not just masks, not just gowns, aspirin, penicillin that you give your children if they have an ear infection, heparin for heart operations. And we've seen what they've done in Australia in the last couple of months. I know you've reported very well on the story of a CCP businessman who bought up all of these private hospitals in Australia, closed them as the pandemic started, shipped millions of masks and personal protective gear back to China. Same happened in America.
Yeah, it involves half a year production.
Go ahead and die. The message is go ahead and die.
Yeah, indeed. Yes, that's a very good book. And also, if it's possible, could you introduce her to me? I'd like to interview her. Yes, because I think that's a very, very relevant topic to address in terms of how, when Clinton administration allowed China to enter the WTO, then just in less than 4 years, your supply chain for the medical projection almost moved, most of them starting, or almost half of them already moved to China.
Oh, yeah.
So and now you can even do not produce the basic medicines, and that's not the worst. You know what? In China, there were so many scandals about these, fake medicines, the vaccines, for children. It's terrible. So
yes.
So you think about how can the American trust the Chinese medicines, producing that way. So because it's all corruption. And those big, say, pharmaceuticals, they are agents of the CCP.
They certainly appear to be, don't they? So here's another book I'd like to share with your viewers. This one is called Chinese Business Etiquette. Put it over here so you can see it.
Wow.
Chinese Business Etiquette. And the man, Scott D. Seligman, is the author. But one of his blurbs comes from a man called Mr. James McGregor, who lives in Shanghai, who used to run AmCham Shanghai. AmCham means American Chamber of Commerce. The AmCham Shanghai Twitter feed has always been the most blatant and naked display of the elite's preference for China's one-party communist dictatorship over what they call our messy democracy. They've really toned it down since the lockdown happened, but don't worry, guys. I've got screenshots. I've been following you, and I have a file with all the things you've said, the outrageous things that you've said about the Chinese people and about the American people. Well, here's a good one from Mr. James McGregor that he said in an interview at the end of January, when everyone in the elite in China knew full well that this pandemic was raging out of Wuhan, and they let everybody travel for Lunar New Year, which was January 15th.
Yeah.
Oh, January 29th, Mr. McGregor gave an interview where he was saying, we've done such a great job relocating the American supply chain to China, and we have bigger plans to have for the future. And all this talk about the concentration camps in Xinjiang is so much blather. So much blather. What if it was his mother, his father, his child, or himself being tortured in a communist concentration camp for the crime of practicing your religion or expressing your ethnic identity? He doesn't care about human life. I would like all these elites to go and spend a day in a Chinese concentration camp and then tell us how terrific it was. So much blather.
Yes, that's about the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. Oh, there are lots of stories.
Follow you can find feed.
Yes, yes.
Follow them.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Would you like to talk about those bankers in Wall Street? So, have you? So, for example, tell us your writing about Google. Oh wow, that's Silicon Valley, yeah, and the CCP in 2008. So, what made you write it? You talk about you published an article about.
Question. Thank you for asking these very straightforward questions, because why did I write it? Because it was shocking, and it was morally reprehensible, and it was outrageous.
Okay.
And to see that what happened was executives from Yahoo and Google and Bill Gates's Microsoft. Don't forget Big Bill Gates. CCP collaborator #1. Oh, sorry, Tim Cook, and also Bill Clinton. They were hauled before a congressional committee to explain why they were collaborating with the Chinese Communist Party, why they were doing technology transfers with the Chinese Communist Party, and why they were censoring content that the Chinese Communist Party felt was sensitive.
Yes.
Like those pesky concentration camps in Tibet and Xinjiang. And they basically waffled. You know, they took the Fifth Amendment and they just kept on doing it, because most politicians have been bought and sold by the same Wall Street criminals who sold us out to the CCP, who wine and dine. Xi Jinping, Hu Jintao, Li Peng, Jiang Zemin, all these characters, whenever they come to town, they get a red carpet. They get a banquet. Mark Zuckerberg is always there. Bill Gates is there. Everybody's smiling for him. But the poor Dalai Lama, His Holiness Dalai Lama, in 2009, President Obama declined to meet with the Dalai Lama. He was the first president since George H.W. Bush first met with the Dalai Lama to refuse to receive him in the White House from Chinese pressure, and also because his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, insisted upon it, because she's so tight with the CCP. And then Obama realized his folly when the CCP double-crossed him at the Copenhagen Climate Summit. So he did agree to meet the Dalai Lama, but it was through the back door, and the photograph that went around the world was the Dalai Lama going by the trash in the White House. Not good optics. Xi Jinping comes, he gets a red carpet and the fine wine, and everyone wants their picture taken with him. Well, it's not going to be a very good look now when you've got tens of thousands of Americans whose lives have been destroyed by the CCP virus. So I think this is a very critical moment. Back to your question about these elites. Here's an idea that I came up with many, many years ago. And I abandoned it because in the Tibet movement, the problem we have is we have no resources. No one will fund us. You can't get a penny to do any serious work about Tibet. Believe me, I've tried. You'd be able to get like a little consultancy here, maybe a 1-month funding there, on a writing assignment here or there, whatever, but not enough to really take on the most powerful people in our society who have empowered the criminals who hold hostage the 1.4 billion people in China. You know, you need resources to do this, and we never had any. All we had was moral outrage, and we were relentless. I used to say that the Tibet activists, we were like squirrels. We're little, we're small, but we have sharp teeth, and it's our job to chip away at their narrative. And one day, maybe the tree will fall down. And if somebody didn't do something, that would be shameful and a disgrace. Well, at least somebody did something. At least myself and Students for a Free Tibet, we were out there every time a Chinese dictator came to town with our Tibetan flags, chanting China lies, people die. And which side are you on, boys? That's the question I'd like to ask these Wall Street elites.
Yeah.
Can see them very nervous right now. They're very nervous. The AmCham Shanghai guys, you watch their Twitter feed, they're trying to walk it back a little bit. Sorry, we have the record. We have a record. I've been keeping record and I've got files.
Yeah, the technology companies, yes, they help.
Sorry?
Sorry, I say you're talking about the technology companies really help the CCP. Yeah, they censor the internet on the internet.
Yeah.
Anything that would displease the CCP, they will try to, you know, to cover it up. Yeah, that's the technology. And also the Wall Street, the bankers, they got so much, you know, money to fund the CCP, and that's Wall Street, and also these politicians. So specifically, what is your view about, for example, like the big VIPs like Bloomberg and Schwarzman? Yeah. You must have lots of things to talk about.
Absolutely. I grew up with these people.
Oh, wow.
I know them intimately. I've met almost all of them. I've never met Mark Zuckerberg or Tim Cook, but I know exactly who and what they are. And I think this goes back to what my project was. My project was to create a truth pledge and send it to all of these people who outsourced American jobs and American medicine to China, communist China, which is probably going to end up with a lot of people dying because they won't be able to get penicillin in the next few months, because you can't rebuild these factories right away. It's going to take time to bring all the factories back from America. Forget about shoes, forget about clothes. It's high tech, it's Boeing, it's medicines, it's technology. Let's not even get into weapon systems, which have also been sent over to the PRC. Why, God knows. But so I wrote a truth pledge one night. I think it was around the time I went and I stood in front of the Xinhua Tower when it was first unveiled to the public.
Yeah.
And the truth pledge basically said, do you acknowledge that the Chinese Communist Party is responsible for the deaths of 80 million of its own people? Yeah. Do you acknowledge that you saw the carnage in Tiananmen Square? Do you acknowledge that the Dalai Lama is a refugee in India because the Chinese Communist Party invaded his country, killed 1.5, maybe 2 million Tibetans? Do you acknowledge that there are at least 1.5, some figures say 2, some figures say 5 million human beings in concentration camps in Xinjiang? I'm now adding to the Truth Pledge for a recent history. And I updated it over the last Christmas to add Hong Kong. Do you acknowledge that the CCP is violating the one country, two systems pledge that they made to the people of Hong Kong? And do you acknowledge that there is police brutality in Hong Kong that shocks the conscience of mankind? Do you? And I would like to send it to all of them. So we need a big backer for this to see if they answer us or not. I have a feeling that, you know, it's always with us Tibet people. No, it's not convenient. We can't meet you today. You know, they couldn't completely slam the door in my face because I was the daughter of a very powerful senator. That's the only thing I had going for me. And so I was relentless. I knocked on every single door. I went to every humanitarian organization. I went to every human rights organization. I lobbied senators again and again. But after my father died, to my face, I was told by every single humanitarian organization, these aren't even the bankers. These are people whose mission statement is to help the students in Hong Kong who've been beaten viciously by the police, or the Tibetan refugees who escaped, you know, like my friend Palin Gatsu. And we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about this later. And, you know, and to my face, they said, we can't work with you, Maura. You're a Tibet person, and our board members have interests in China. Now, I was told that by Human Rights Watch, Human Rights First, Freedom House, all these organizations. So I would say to them, are you telling me that you're siding with a totalitarian dictatorship that tortures children in concentration camps? over His Holiness Dalai Lama, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate and the greatest Buddhist master of our time? Is that what you're telling me? And you know what they would do? They wouldn't answer. They wouldn't.
That's a difficult question.
Well,
that make them ashamed. Yeah.
They should say, Maura, you got a point. At least one older man at Freedom House, which was created by Eleanor Roosevelt after World War II. Let's remember, most of these organizations were created after the Holocaust, after the catastrophe of the Nazi control of Europe and World War II, in which 6 million European Jews were slaughtered in concentration camps. And today, people are tortured in CCP concentration camps with methods of cruelty that would make a Nazi proud. I have spent years interviewing mostly Tibetans, but Uyghur and Chinese friends as well, who somehow survived being in a Chinese prisoner concentration camp. Again, arrested for counter-revolutionary thought, like Dr. Li and Liu Xiaobo. So I think now we have an opportunity to do things like this truth pledge, to at least embarrass and shame and expose the collaborators. I know that with Mr. Guo, one thing you do is the exposed revolution.
Yes.
Which I think is wonderful.
Yeah.
Which is
we shame them and name them. Yes.
Name them and shame them.
Shame them. Yes.
Shame them and name them.
Yeah. Yeah. So, a question. So, according to your personal experience, how has the political sentiment towards the CCP changed over the years?
I've never seen it change so fast than it has since the pandemic forced the lockdown of our great cities. And it's taking away people we love, 3 per minute. I'm now getting phone calls from friends, thoughtful, intelligent people, educated people, sophisticated New Yorkers and people I knew. I used to also live in Boston and Washington. I'm an East Coast. I come from the East Coast elite. So these are educated people, thoughtful people. And for years and years, they'd roll their eyes. Oh, Maura, come on. You know, if Bill Gates says it's okay to work with China, if Bill Clinton says it's okay to work with China, if Steve Schwarzman started the Schwarzman Scholars and he said about 3 years ago on public television, he was committing $100 million to train the future leaders of the Chinese Communist Party. Well, American kids get saddled with debt for going to college, but if you're Chinese communist, it's easier to get into Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. Xi Jinping's daughter, by the way, went to Harvard as an undergraduate. She was in class of 2014, but they also gave her a pseudonym, and Harvard totally collaborated with this. And a friend of mine who is was an admissions counselor at Princeton and later at Harvard said, if your father is a Chinese communist, it's much easier to get into a top college than if your grandfather built that college. That's the situation. So back to what your question was. I'm sorry, I got a little off topic. People are calling me in tears saying, Maura, you were right. You were right. You were right about China. I'm sorry I didn't listen more. I'm sorry I didn't pay attention more. But Maura, I'm really glad you did bring it to my attention, because at least it was sort of in the back of my mind that something's wrong here. It's not quite right.
Yeah. Yeah. But this is such a high price to pay.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, for them to learn it finally.
So yeah, it's too high.
It is too high. So yeah, and thank you so much. So we talk about the CCP's accomplices.